If you've ever recommended someone watch Hunter x Hunter, chances are you said something along the lines of, "It gets really good, but you'll need to get through the first couple of arcs using willpower." And if you saw my previous video, you know I had some trouble getting through the Hunter exam on my first watch through. But in hindsight, I sort of wished that I'd been paying closer attention. I wish that I'd noticed the nuances of the character development rather than being content with the archetypes I saw on the surface and deciding I'd seen them all before. The reason it annoys me that I didn't pick up on the subtleties on my first watch is because I was playing completely into the show's hands. I'm sitting here thinking, I'm an experienced shonen watcher, impress me green boy. And then he goes, and I go, typical, and then zone out for 20 seconds to congratulate myself on being very intellectual and not falling for cliches. I don't know why I was so pessimistic going in, but let's go through all the cool stuff I missed character by character. Kurapika spends most of this arc being quite a good boy, so most of the time that he's on screen, we tend not to worry about whether he's eventually gonna go too far in pursuit of his revenge, because his revenge mission is one of the first things that he mentions when we meet him, because it's his goal, it's why he's becoming a hunter. But whenever he's distracted from that goal, we see a person with a pretty strong and stable sense of morality. That's somewhat in contrast to Gon and Killua, because where Gon operates exclusively on how he feels about a person, Kurapika is someone who puts some thought into what it means for him to be a good human, and who approaches most situations immediately aiming for what he perceives to be the most reasonable outcome. And then he pursues that with a sense of relative calm and rationality. Apparently he inspired Sasuke, and it's not difficult to see how with the eye powers and the slaughtered family, but those are superficial similarities, and as characters they don't actually share a lot of traits. Where Sasuke is eventually consumed by his desire for revenge, Kurapika is afraid the opposite will happen, that his rage will eventually fade and he'll let his pursuit of the Phantom Troop and the eyes of his brethren go. And it makes sense, because Kurapika has no problem putting his eventual goal of avenging his clan aside when it's not immediately relevant, which is something Sasuke never did. For Sasuke, his trauma is obvious and heavy when we first meet him, and while of course there are times when it's not on the forefront of his mind, unlike Kurapika, Sasuke's backstory seems to inform every aspect of his personality. He's ostracized himself from the community of the Leaf Village before we even meet him. He has no reason to fear that his anger will fade, because he's already given up on everything except his revenge. That's why Kurapika can make friends still, and Sasuke's forever a lonely edgelord. That's not to say that Kurapika doesn't have his edgy moments, but I think even when we get to Yorknew, he's much more stable than mid-series Sasuke ever was. We get to see the vengeful side of Kurapika in the Hunter exam thanks to this blue freak claiming to be Majitani, one of the Phantom Troop's 4 kings, and you have to respect the fact that he just completely made that up. When I watched it the first time, I was sure that was a character who was gonna come up at some point. I thought he was gonna look vaguely like this guy, assumed the scheme was based on some sort of knowledge of the troop, but apparently he just made up a name and a rank for himself, and that's pretty bold, and I respect it. The most interesting thing about this fight, in my opinion, is that Kurapika is aware from the beginning that this guy is not a member of the Phantom Troop, right? So this scene is what lets us know that there are limits to Kurapika's stability and rationality, not only when it comes to the Phantom Troop directly, but also anyone who has the nerve to just bring it up around him. So in this scene he taps into this Sasuke sensibility where it doesn't really matter if you have anything to do with it. Kurapika's traumatic backstory justifies him beating the shit out of you anyway. And as we talked about earlier, this isn't really the kind of person he is. He prefers to avoid fighting whenever possible, as he explains in the interview with Netero. He also calms down quite quickly after knocking out Majitani of the 4 Kings, which implies that this side of him is something he's actively trying to suppress, at least when it comes to a fake Phantom Troop member like this one. The scene is here to let us see a little bit of the Kurapika we get to know once we're in Yorknew. The instinctual rage, then followed by his morality catching up with him, is the pattern we see both in this scene and in the Yorknew arc as a whole, but we'll get there when we get there. Gon and Kurapika both have interesting setups for the characters in this arc, but I'd argue Killua is the only one who goes through any meaningful progression over the course of the Hunter exam. More and more is revealed about his character throughout the story, starting with the 2 casual conversation about him wounding his mother and brother, through him killing the 2 needlessly aggressive side characters, and culminating in the scene with the Lumi towards the end. The first scene catches you off guard because Killua speaks so casually about cutting up his family, and then Gon hardly reacts to it at all, and we'll get to him. But the result is that it's also nonchalant and quick, that you can miss the quite serious implications that are actually there. That is, until you get to this scene, where it's pretty clear that this background is not a joke. We can assume that he was telling the truth about his family, but Killua is still acting as if it barely matters that he killed 2 people. And it wouldn't matter to someone who's grown up doing little else. Anything you do as a young child is normal in the world of that child, so it's natural that he wouldn't see it as much of an issue, even if he's already decided that he doesn't want to do it anymore. 2 idiots more on the list probably doesn't matter to him at this point. And finally, in the tournament, when confronted by Illumi, the same conversation is treated with the kind of gravity we intuitively feel that it deserves. Before we talk about the confrontation though, it's worth mentioning the ball game Killua, Gon and Netero played. I bring it up here in the Killua section because while it shows off both Gon and Killua's personalities, for Gon that just means we see more determination, something we see from him in almost any scenario where there's something to be determined about. For Killua, this scene is much more revealing. Up until this point, we haven't seen him struggle with anything in the exam. He's been disappointed at the lack of challenge, yet at the point when Netero provides an actual challenge, Killua sees that he can't beat him and he immediately gives up, foreshadowing not only what's going to be his plotline in the first half of the Chimera Ant arc, but also the immediate confrontation coming up with his brother. Illumi spells it out most clearly during their exchange. He tells Killua directly that he's going to kill Gon, and then that Killua won't do anything to help him, because Killua knows he's not strong enough to beat Illumi. And that's exactly how it plays out. No matter what the stakes are, if Killua doesn't believe he can win, he's not trying. And the stakes are high in this case, right? All Killua wants is to hang out with Gon, yet even with Illumi promising to kill him, Killua feels powerless to do anything about it. Except of course, Illumi doesn't kill Gon, which almost makes it worse, because it allows you to imagine what the family dynamic in the Soldic household has been like for Killua, living with people who will say or do almost anything to make him conform to their idealized version of him as the next head of the Soldic family. The Hunter exam ends with a Killua that's quite different from the person we see in the beginning of the arc. We start off with like a cool assassin type character, and we end up with a 12-year-old who wants nothing more than for his family to give him a chance to discover himself. And that's what this is all about for Killua. He's just been living in this lane laid out for him by his family, and because they're so overbearing and protective of him at all times, they're almost forcing this rebellion to happen. So he eventually runs away to take part in the Hunter exam, and he admits that it's not for any particular reason, except that he heard it was a challenge. And what that seems like to me is that he's just trying out ways of life that aren't the one his family has in store for him. He's experimenting. Later on in Whale Island, we learn that he feels aimless, which is exactly how you would feel when you realize that the thing you've been doing your whole life isn't really what you want to be doing. But for now, he's content with having a friend, content with following Gon's adventure, and that's enough. And it'll continue to be enough until he finds the things he needs to do for himself. Gon as a character is arguably the clearest example of a trope subversion in the show, and as a result he starts his journey with the classic features of the shonen protagonist on full display. He has a goal, he has determination, he makes friends easily, he's strong despite his young age, and most importantly he's dumber than everyone around him. But Takashi's pulling a Hisoka here. He's throwing character traits up in the air and it's colorful and fun, so you somehow miss the fact that there's a severed arm in there as well. And the arm in this metaphor represents the fact that Gon is a complete psychopath. They don't address it until Greed Island, and even then it's an offhand comment. But Killua is a murderer at this point in the story, but Gon does not care. And sure, Gon doesn't see Killua kill the 2 randos here, but he asks no question about the assassin family business. He shows no reaction to Killua ripping this man's heart out. And granted, he's an asshole, but Gon grew up on a tiny island doing normal kid stuff, like going on dates with older women apparently. And still nothing in the Hunter exam phases him? It's suspicious, that's all I'm saying. And still, calling him a psychopath isn't quite fair, because it's ignoring all the playing cards or whatever the analogy was. It's ignoring the obvious traits that we talked about earlier. Gon does care about his family, he cares about his friends, but outside of those people, doesn't seem to mind whether you live or die really. And it's not like he chooses the best people to befriend. Killua is the obvious example, because he's an assassin. But there's also Tompa, slayer of rookies and confirmed biggest penis in the series, who Gon seems to at least kind of like for no apparent reason. It would have been interesting actually if Tompa had died, to see if Gon would care. I'm not sure if he would or not. The point is, Gon isn't a psychopath as in someone without empathy. He's just incredibly self-centered. If you don't matter to him, you don't matter. Gon's biggest scene in the Hunter exam is the fight with Hanzo, in my opinion. It's the clearest example of his protagonist's determination powers. I want to find my dad, I want to become a hunter, I'm not backing down. And that's good, it's very on genre, but it's kind of an unusual setting to be so determined in. Naruto's first use of protagonist jutsu is in order to save Iruka-sensei right at the beginning of the story. Luffy's is probably against Arlong in order to liberate Nami's village. For those two, what happens is that determination translates to combat power, and they gain a massive boost in strength. But the world of Nen isn't quite so generous. Gon can't do anything with all his determination. The same thing happened when he took Hisoka's badge. He loses it immediately, and powerless to help himself, he has to rely on the charity of his opponent to continue on his path. He takes the Hisoka incident much harder than the Hanzo fight, but essentially, the same thing happens. He's powerless to do anything against him, so he ends up being given the victory because the opponent admires his character. It happens to be the best choice Hanzo could make for himself as well, since killing Gon would have disqualified him and nothing else seems to have any effect, which might be why Gon doesn't spiral into depression again. But I want to rewind a little bit to the determination and the odd scenario in which Gon shows it. What would have happened if the scene was reversed? So Gon is fighting someone much weaker than him, someone else who refuses to give up. Then suddenly those determination lines he threw at the camera earlier can be used to justify something much darker than what we end up getting in this scene. Would he have gone through with what Hanzo couldn't, rather than give up the fight? He tells Hanzo that if he backs down now, he feels he'll never be able to find his dad. Does that still apply with a different opponent? That's maybe my favorite thing about this arc in hindsight, all the little ways that it could have gone much worse. What if Kurapika had noticed Hisoka's Phantom Troop tattoo? What if Illumi had followed through on his threats? It's all very precarious because most shonen start your protagonists off fighting a relatively weak villain in the first arc. But in Hunter x Hunter, the first arc introduces two antagonists who aren't even beaten by the end of the anime. And I know that you don't know that the first time through, but there's a very real sense that our protagonists would lose in a fight against their respective opponents every single time. This gives the whole story a much more realistic sense of progression than you would have if you do the typical thing of introducing a strong antagonist and then having the protagonist beat him by the end of the arc. I was told ahead of time that this arc was going to be a bit slow and a bit less interesting than the series becomes eventually, and I think as a result I didn't catch a lot of the details that are interesting about the Hunter exam. I understand why people say that, because it's true that this arc lacks a lot of the emotional and psychological payoff that makes the series as a whole so good, and the problem is partially a tendency to talk about these stories in the arc format. Something I'm now actively contributing to, I realize, but the Hunter exam is only an arc in the sense that they become hunters at the end of it. All the character work is set up for future plot points. Illumi and Killua aren't resolved, the fight with Hisoka isn't resolved, Kurapika doesn't learn anything about his clan or the Phantom Troop, except I suppose Hisoka's hint at the end, but that's set up for a different arc as well. The point is that the Hunter exam is more like a first novel in a fantasy epic than it is the first arc of a typical shonen story. It's there to make sure you know all the players in the game, who they are, what their goals are, so that the show can mess with all of that later. Shonen usually do that for their main characters, but not for their antagonists, and not for side characters that aren't relevant until 100 episodes further in. Anyway, it's worth considering when you recommend the show to a friend. Rather than telling them to power through the first couple of arcs, maybe suggest that they look for the details that the show is trying to hide. Because I think that if you catch some of this character work on a first watch, it'll make for a better experience all in all than having to go back and only appreciating the beginning of the story in hindsight. Thanks for sticking around to the end. I hope you enjoyed it.